Hello there, welcome back to Morning at NTV. It's 8:01 a.m. You now know how the roads look like. How about you get into some critical conversations right here on our Take Note segment. Hashtag Morning at NTV is where we can engage. You can also tag us directly at Malaki Vilodera and at Romeo Bisiku across all the social media platforms. Now, we're going to be having this conversation with regards to the Abuja Declaration 2001, where all African Union countries did pledge and said, hey, we're going to honor this up, and say, of course, this meant that every single African country will set aside 15% of the national budget, and all that ought to go to the health sector. But that is not happening. Quite a number of African countries are falling short of that particular pledge. So why is this the reason, and what alternatives could we pretty much take advantage of to ensure that that side doesn't suffer? We have a healthy people, and thanks to that, then a healthy economy. That's the conversation that we're getting into this morning. And in studios, we are joined by
someone from the Uganda Debt Network. He's the Director of Programs, and that is Julius Kapwepwe, and he joins us right now in studio. Good morning.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Now, talk to us about why African countries have failed to make the contributions they agreed to.
Thank you, moderator.
Yes.
And in principle, the African countries have got a context. A number of them, even if we took an example of your immediate neighbor just in the north, South Sudan,
yes,
have gone through phases of conflict. And some others continue to. If you looked at Somalia, if you looked at the situation in the Bukavu area in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, there have been those scenarios. If you looked further south, say in Mozambique, there have been cases of abuse of public resources, including borrowed resources. If you looked at the case of North Africa, there has been political conflict and governance challenges, Tunisia, Egypt, and a number of those countries. If you looked at Ghana, if you looked at Angola, if you looked at some of those countries have been commodity dependent, especially oil, cocoa. Upon slump of prices, then there is a challenge to meeting the scale of budget expectations. And necessarily that means that you cannot finance all your ambitions. In the case of Uganda, we've had a history of turmoil for a number of years. About half the time we've been independent was spent on chaos, president after president, and all this mischief that comes with it. Therefore, that means that you can only look to, if you looked at the crime in South Africa, from before the apartheid era, now into the apartheid era, and later on what we are seeing even today. So those situations cause shocks in the capacity of the economies to be able to generate revenues that then you would talk about the allocation, including the Abuja Declaration that she has talked about. So there is also that bit of context. Of course, the other bit is also that African countries have remained gold mines for the global north, particularly for the global north. In Uganda, we have lots of gold deposits.
right.
There is a lot of gold extraction. Who benefits utmost from that kind of undertaking? We have got marble, for instance, in Karamoja area, and a number of other very high value resources in Muko, iron ore, in southwestern Uganda, in Kigezi area. Are we tapping into all those to be able to maximize opportunities that would come with those kinds of undertakings, assuming we are doing the manufacturing here from scratch? You get through to the last product and you have this refined gold and the earring that ladies like her like having on. Those would fetch us a lot of money, but we tend to lose those kinds of opportunities to the economies in Europe and also in America.
So you think African countries have not hit to the Abuja Declaration because, one, political instability, two, underutilization of the minerals?
then also disasters. Look at floods in a number of areas and the destruction that comes there also. Even in an effort to utilize the ritual that you have, there are those kinds of disasters, man or woman made, but also others that are, acts of God, as you say.
And whenever we are having these conversations that touch on the reality of how rich the African continent is, and the reality that we are one of the poorest continents in the globe, really, and yet we hold all these resources, it just worries some, and I think it just aggravates others. And I always have these conversations with my peers, and you just get agitated and angry because you don't understand. Then at what point are we selling ourselves short? Because if we have all these resources, and you rightfully say, at the end of the day, if they're extracted, the majority and the major shareholder or beneficiary of this is the first world, then who is failing Africa? Are we selling ourselves short? Is it the leadership? What is the problem?
As Africans, we suffer from a number of malnutrition challenges. So malnutrition across the spectrum is one of the key areas. The malnutrition I'm talking about is not this one of food alone. Yes. I'm also talking about the malnutrition in terms of us investing more in ourselves and looking more inward than running out there for other people's money. For instance, running to China and running to Turkey, running to Sweden for other people's money before we have exhausted our own pot domestically. So there is an opportunity beyond the lamentations that we've gone through. A whole cocktail of lamentations has been slapped on Africans. But we need to look to how do we go to the next level and be able to redeem ourselves as an African people.
Is that possible?
And African economies.
Is that possible?
One of the ways, for instance, is for us to continue investing in the infrastructural areas, as we have seen the ports in Dar es Salaam, at Okasa here, at Lake Victoria in Uganda, in Mombasa, Lamu in North Kenya, and a number of those kinds of facilities. We are aware that that is not as easy as said because of the nature of investment that you need. Where is this whole huge money going to come from? So those are the number of areas we could be looking at in terms of strategically getting out of this pathetic situation, but also looking at how do we raise money that is able to usher us those kinds of investable areas that could give us dividends at the end of the day.
Let's take an example before we go to Romeo. Let's take an example of the oil exploration that we are undertaking.
Yeah.
And a majority of experts have argued that if only we had the capacity or the wisdom to negotiate better, would ultimately be the best and the highest beneficiaries out of this particular kind of project. So if we don't have the capacity to extract this amazing wealth out of our ground, why then can't we negotiate well enough? Because it seems like we say that, hey, we don't have the capacity, okay, come here, help us to extract it, but at the end of the day, they end up to be the greatest beneficiaries, and yet we own the resources. So what should be done in that respect, just to ensure that our leaders negotiate better when it comes to some of these deals?
Broadly, there is hope for Africa. Even in the case of negotiations, we have seen tremendous improvement in capacities across the spectrum. One of the opportunities our governments need to utilize is not just close themselves in those doors and think that that is all. There has to be a whole series of undertaking. Before you go to Japan at the TICAD meeting that has just ended, how have you prepared? What level of homework have you done back home? Open up a public discussion on this particular area. How should we go about it once we're in Japan? That is going to be one of the areas, because the government leaders and technocrats are not monopolies of knowledge. There is a whole knowledge spectrum amongst Ugandans that we can tap into. The other bit is for us to improve our negotiations by going, as for instance, as regional economic blocks Why do you want to face the Japanese or the Chinese or the English? Just as Uganda, just as Rwanda, just as Kenya. Let's go as an East African community, meaning we have done our homework on the key areas we can negotiate upon, the non-negotiables, the compromises, and then you go with a full picture of jointed effort. Of joint effort. In the past, we've had cases of some people I know will not wish to hear about this, but in the days of Amin, when he was the president of Uganda, in New York, in the US, there was a time when there was a Ugandan embassy at Uganda House, the Ugandan embassy on the other floors, and the Rwandan embassy on the next floors within the same building. So can we have those kinds of relations rejuvenated? Then we go as a force and we can face. In the case of oil, I think we have also made progress, challenges notwithstanding when you look at the current discussions going on. But let's learn from a country like Dubai, one of the United Arab Emirates as an example. You'll notice that it generates its revenues up to about 60% just from transactions.
Correct.
Services.
Correct.
Okay? It generates about 10% from other sources of revenue. Like state corporations making a profit into the state coffers for joint development as a people of Dubai. And it makes the least percent actually from oil.
And imagine.
Not that we have got, they have got lesser oil than us. But in terms of configuration, economic configuration, as a country, we must look beyond oil. We must continue investing more aggressively and therefore expecting a dividend at the end of the day in the health being of the people, in the infrastructural being of our economy, in the other investable areas over and above oil. Oil should instead come in as a complementary, not the other way around, because it is an infinite resource. We already have challenges about oil, as you have seen, some of the companies threatening to pull out. So what if that was to be the case? Do we just keep in the book of lamentations? We need to go beyond.
Well, Julius, let's revert back to the high cost of the healthcare. Now, the high cost of healthcare negatively impacts household incomes.
Absolutely.
So why do governments fail to see or fail to deem investment in healthcare as a move to end poverty?
Governments have made commendable effort. At least some governments in Africa and beyond. Look at the case of the Sustainable Development Goals as an example. Sustainable Development Goal 3 is on healthcare, good healthcare and well-being of the citizens. Do we have a country like Uganda that is a signatory to that kind of commitment? The answer is yes. Have we seen progressive investment in the health sector, at least from the side of financing? The answer is yes. So there is an effort, but that effort needs to be accelerated even faster. That effort needs to have contribution by the other stakeholders so that we are able to put into the same goalpost as we look for better ways of how some of these things can be done.
You know, the question would come through and a majority would ask then, why did we rush so fast to sign into this particular declaration, the 2001 Abuja Declaration, if we knew our realities that at the end of the day would not honor or pledge up to this? Because as I look at the statistics that were released by the UN now, the countries that are on track are just 3. We have Mauritius, Eritrea, and Seychelles. We have some countries that are trying so hard and they are making progress. These are 16 countries: Gabon, Liberia, Mozambique, Cote d'Ivoire, and the list continues. But them that are making critical progress and amazing progress in that regard are 16. Now, the insufficient progress, that's where the big number lies. And we have over 27 countries
including Uganda.
Including Uganda and even Kenya, honestly. So why, it seems like African countries just rush up to sign, to be signatory to some of these declarations just for the sake of, we belong.
To be part of the club.
Exactly, to be part of the club. Why is that? Where is the pressure coming from? And yet we know our reality is that we're not at that stage.
You have to begin from somewhere. The African countries and other countries that have, for instance, signed to the Sustainable Development Goals are working on an aspiration. No wonder you are saying that about 3 countries so far are in line, are on course, while the others are also around the correct course. That means progressively we are moving to the next steps. Of course, those which are lagging behind need to put up their stockings, and that is an area that needs to be looked at. But that you sign and you commit and we see progressive improvement can only be the way to go. Right. Some of these bits are not going to.
So, Julius, let's talk a little bit about public debt. Uganda's public debt currently stands at around $15.4 billion, and the GDP is around $25 billion.
Yeah.
Now, we have to borrow big sums of money to finance the budget. Now, the reason government is remitting little money to the health sector, they give this argument that we have to finance this loan that we've taken from, let's say, IMF or the World Bank. Now, how best can we finance the health sector vis-a-vis the infrastructure in the country without borrowing? Because it makes the high cost of healthcare and financing of the infrastructure.
First, correct the impression. Uganda no longer receives financing from the International Monetary Fund. We as a country have graduated beyond that. Some other African countries are still in that bracket. Uganda has gone
and the World Bank?
To other windows. We are borrowing from the World Bank.
Nice.
If you looked at, and where you correctly observe, for instance, if you looked at this current financial year that we are in, between 21 and 22 trillions is what we expect as our domestic revenues. Of that, 10.7 trillion is what will go into debt repayment, debt servicing. So you are right, that huge chunk of money is otherwise foregone for the other economies. So the health sector here misses it. The infrastructure that we would have had faster and earlier is a missed opportunity. But how did we get there? And is borrowing a problem? We have argued, many of us have argued that borrowing is not a problem per se. It is rather about what you borrow for and whether you respect it. If you borrow and you promise to build a Kampala expressway, assuming there was a certain Kampala expressway somewhere, and you've estimated that that money is going to be sufficient for that road, and also indicated to us how we are going to pay back. Of course, one of the ways of paying back is you and me through your respective taxes as the citizens of the respective nations. But if that project has its money stolen and you go for a second level of a loan for the same project, even a fourth one, definitely you are heading for disaster. Some of the countries are in that situation. Others borrow and money is not utilized. They have the capacity to run for someone else's money, sign on, come back here. They don't have even the capacity to absorb it.
So in the case of Uganda, how best can we finance our roads vis-a-vis health sector without borrowing these large sums of money?
Borrowing for some time will remain one of the windows. Beyond that, we need to look more to domestic resources, to domestic revenue mobilization. We need to look more to stopping the stealing of government, of citizens' money through government channels. Those who steal are known. The Auditor General has been very clear. We need to see a full recovery of those funds that are otherwise stolen with near impunity. Of course, we would also wish to look forward to a time when the African states can rejuvenate their state corporations, and then the state corporations, just like we've seen with an earlier example of Dubai, the state corporations generate a dividend. If you have an MTN, just as a case, that is Ugandan, not privately owned, the level of profit which you've seen in the papers yourselves would imply that that money is going into the state coffers.
Right.
So that becomes a profit that we can work on as the people of Uganda.
Right. And I think what you're saying is critical, because that conversation was very robust just a few months ago, where we're having multinationals taking back the profits back to their states. And that is a conversation that we're getting into, as well as fighting corruption, just to ensure that the health sector is robust and working service delivery. But over and above that, as you're speaking about alternatives, just a few weeks back, the Ministry of Health said, hey, we have an idea and a proposal whereby we'll be having a national insurance scheme. Do you think this is going to take off? And if it is to take off successfully, what needs to be considered?
As Uganda Debt Network, we have organized a Pan-African conference and involved a number of African countries, including Ghana, of course Uganda being the host, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Kenya, South Sudan,
even Zimbabwe,
and a number, Zimbabwe from the perspective of the SADC, of the South African Development Corporation, about 13 countries of them, if much more. So the learning is what we would wish to hear about and have that experience of, if you are Tanzania and you have a health insurance scheme, Rwanda, how have you done it? What is it? What lesson, one or two, could we learn from you, if at all? Ethiopia, we've heard stories that it is cheaper to build a road in Ethiopia, which is even so hilly compared to Uganda.
Right.
Cheaper in Ethiopia than in Uganda. Muganda would say, what is the magic that you... So learning from some of our comrades across the African region is precisely what we would wish to look at. And the National Health Insurance Scheme, some of the loopholes notwithstanding, at least to the extent of the bill, is one of the ways to go. Okay. Is it the only way? Does it cover everybody? Is it equivalent to universal health coverage? If otherwise you have a section of, say, the workers who are covered, what happens to the other people who don't work in the formal structures?
Well, you've hinted on a very, very, very pertinent issue, and that is insurance schemes. Now, share with us the role of health insurance schemes in improving access to healthcare services in Africa.
Yeah, while I'm not an expert on health insurance schemes, I'm not even an insurer, but I use insurance windows.
True.
It is obvious. Bring your less money here, 10,000 shillings here. When you fall sick, we shall be able to cover you up to 50,000. 5 times, in other words. There are the skeptics who will ask, but how about if you don't fall sick?
Right.
If you don't fall sick, you forfeit that money. It's kind of a bargain, it's kind of a risk management strategy. And increasingly, we need to get to that level as the African people.
Right.
We can discuss the details of how should that exactly function.
Okay.
And precisely that's what part of what our conversation at the UDN organized meeting is going to be about.
All right, so tomorrow to the 13th of September, we're going to be having the Pan-African Conference. What should the viewers be expecting, and what are the deliberations that you're hoping will change this particular kind of sector?
Our theme is financing alternatives for infrastructure, mainly roads, and then universal health care, not just health insurance, but universal health care beyond borrowing.
Is universal health care a viable idea in Africa?
That's the whole point.
Right.
That's the whole point of the discussion. The experts, like a number of those countries have highlighted, Ghana, Tanzania, who have been there, we'll share with us, what does it take? Is it feasible? So Ugandans should expect a discussion around those areas. We have our media channels and avenues, not only radio and television, but also the social media channels, and we'll share the details, and we would wish Ugandans to wake up and come to this conversation. Don't just leave it to government. If you leave it to government, government takes the ultimate decision. Don't say you was never consulted. So be part of the discussion, bring your own ideas to the fore. It may be that very idea that you are sitting on that may be the idea, actually. So we encourage Ugandans to write more, speak more about these matters of how can we finance infrastructure beyond the borrowing trend that we seem to see.
Okay, as we wrap up, what would be your last call to the government in as far as financing our roads and health sector minus borrowing?
Government needs to come to the realization that the global economic outlook, for instance, is not pleasant. If you looked at the Eurozone as a case, the growth of 1.9% economic growth, the growth rate, that necessarily means that the scale of grants and loans on the other side the subsidized loans are going to reduce. So we can only brace ourselves for commercial loans.
Right.
If that is the case, how then do we look more internally to making sure that before we go for someone else's money, we have utilized ours?
And I think also a conversation that has wrapped this up finally, one of the alternatives as well that is being considered heavily is the public-private partnerships, just to ensure that this is sorted out within, and this borrowing thing outside becomes a thing of the past.
Yeah. The public-private partnerships are already a reality with us in Uganda and a number of other African countries. We only need to ensure that they are more transparent and accountable. If company X has project Y, was it through an open bidding process?
Correct.
Or was it through mischief? Okay. If it was through mischief, then we expect problems. If it was an open process, then the best bid would carry the day, and perhaps that is going to be one of the contributory areas.
Mr. Kapwepo Julius, Director of Programs at Uganda Debt Network, many thanks for honoring our invitation.
My pleasure.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're still watching Morning at NTV. At this juncture, we cross over and talk to our reporter Stephen Bide to give us the latest with regards to traffic flow this morning. Bide, if you can hear me.
Yes, Romeo, indeed, I can hear you and get you clearly just here at Chiwatule. At the junction, of course, this junction leads you towards Ntinda and connects, brings the people coming from Chira, Najera, Chiwatule, and the rest of areas, that side of Chira Municipality and Nakawa Division, for those coming from the other side of Nalia but trying